your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. When you hear the term pop art, chances are these are some of the images that first come to mind. And chances are you all know who the artist is of all three. Andy Warhol, the greatest artist of the second half of the 20th century. But there's another prominent artist whose work would come to represent the 60s and pop art itself, just like Warhol's, Roy Lichtenstein's, of course. Yet Warhol created his first pop art paintings months before Liechtenstein's. Warhol would return to Superman 20 years later with his trademark silkscreen technique. But then there are these peculiar Superman collages. I say peculiar because though they're signed by Warhol in 1960, they use comic book panels that were published years later. How could that be possible? Unless they're fraudulent works? That's part of what we're going to discuss in this webinar, the relationship between Andy Warhol and Superman. And my name is Arlen Schumer. For those of you who've never been to my webinars before, don't know me, I did a book about comic book history called The Silver Age of Comic Art, about how the mainstream superhero comic book art of Marvel and DC Comics reflected what was happening in the 1960s itself. I use the work of these 8 men primarily, the men that I believe in the same way we look back 500 years ago on the great Renaissance masters like Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Raphael. So too do I believe future art historians are going to look back at these men and their works as our great masters of our Renaissance of the human figure. Like Neil Adams, whose work primarily for DC Comics, shown there on the right side, ghosted behind the introductory text. He also did, of course, a great Superman, shown here in a double-page spread wraparound cover, which I'm showing you because this is a piece of art I found off the internet. A great mashup between an actual ersatz version of Adam's Superman. That's not actually his Superman face there. And of course, if you know your Norman Rockwell, you would recognize the foreground figure as being from this 1962 Saturday Evening Post cover, which Rockwell titled The Connoisseur. Now, though done in 1962, it's Rockwell commenting, of course, on the abstract expressionism that dominated the art world the previous dozen or so years. You know, Rockwell, shown here in his studio in Massachusetts, he painted the background image first and the man separately. And he actually submitted the knockoff version of Pollock's into an art exhibition and signed it with a fake Italian signature, and he won the contest. But there's, of course, Jackson Pollock himself, and he came to represent the abstract expressionist movement. It was first coined in 1946, but it came to dominate the 1950s, as you can see here in this exhibition catalog of Museum of Modern Art, which really put abstract expressionism on the map. Here's a photo in 1950 of all the major, obviously male and white players in the abstract expressionist New York City-based scene. You can see Pollock labeled there in the middle. Now, artists that would soon be coming to New York would be the focus of our webinar tonight. That would be Andy Warhol in the foreground with his friends Dorothy Cantor and Philip Pearlstein, all painters, all graduating from Carnegie Tech, as Carnegie Mellon was known back then. And they'd all moved to New York City in 1950. Warhol would, of course, change his name to Warhol and move in with Pearlstein, who would later then marry Cantor. And Perlstein, yes, the Philip Perlstein. In the early 50s, he's doing some kind of mixture between figurative art and the kind of abstract expressionist painting. And then in 1952, he does what is supposedly a series of comic art inspired paintings that he only did between, it says here, 1949 to 52. So there's not really a firm date, but he later abandoned it. Now, it's interesting. He's in New York City. He does this painting of Superman. A year later in Mad magazine, or the Mad comic book as it was known in 1953, would do its first Superman classic satire illustrated by the great Wally Wood. So who knows? Maybe Wally Wood might have peeked into Philip Perlstein's New York City studio that he was sharing with Andy Warhol. Of course, Perlstein has gone on to become the man credited with bringing back figurative art to American art itself. And he's still going strong, I think at 90 years old. But there were, of course, some artists in New York City not included in this photo that were like more kind of downtown, and that would be Larry Rivers. Larry Rivers did a painting in 1953 called Washington Cross. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to show you Larry Rivers was doing, similar to Perlstein, a mixture between figurative art and abstract expressionism, as you can see here in this example. But yes, here's the painting I wanted to say that he does in 1953 that has him considered to be, by scholars, make him the godfather or the grandfather even of pop art, because he was one of the first artists to really merge this non-objective, non-narrative art with narrative and objective abstraction. Now, in his autobiography, Rivers claimed, of course, Washington Crossing the Delaware, his Washington Crossing the Delaware, is not a variation on the famous 1851 painting with the same name, of course, by Emanuel Leutze, but an Americanized reflection on Tolstoy's War and Peace that he had recently read in its original edition. And he called it a subversion of the abstract expressionism of the time. And there it is, 1953. So in a way, that's a definition of one of the progenitors of pop art. So at the same time in New York City, you have the young Robert Rauschenberg doing these collages also between 51 and 53, and actually includes clippings and images, materials taken from his immediate environment. Another early definition of pop art. So of course, this one is called Mona Lisa from 1952. There's Rauschenberg in his New York studio. There's Rebus from 1955. Again, you can see the mixed media, the clippings, and there in the center is yet another appropriation of comic strips. And I say another one because, you know, the appropriation of collage and clippings from mainstream materials. I mean, this was Picasso's Aubon Marche, which was a Paris department store. That's 1913. Then you have American Stuart Davis doing this painting in 1924 called Lucky Strike. I love the zigzag papers, which are my preferred rolling papers, of course. Here's another Rauschenberg from 1956 called Gloria. And again, you can see the mixture of the, looks like tabloid photograph clippings on top. 56 is an interesting year. Not only is it the beginning really of rock and roll with Elvis Presley, but in some ways it's the beginning of the art that was branded pop art. And it doesn't come from an American, but it comes from an English artist named Richard Hamilton. And this collage is about maybe, you know, like the size of a record album cover. And it's, again, it's not a painting, it's a collage. And of course, it was dubbed pop art because of the Tootsie Pop, yes, being held by our hunk. Now, Hamilton actually had an American artist friend send him random clippings. So it's kind of a William Burroughs, literally a cut and paste technique. Hamilton just assembled these random clippings that he was given by his American artist friend. And yes, in the background there is a clipping from a house ad in a comic book for young romance. Yes, the romance genre was created by artist-writers Jack Kirby and his partner, Joe Simon. And this is from 1950. So it's interesting that from that point on, comics and pop art would always be linked together. Now, this is the image that's usually dubbed as the first pop art, again, not a painting, but the first pop art image. And yet, take a look at this called I Was a Rich Man's Plaything from 1947 by a Scottish artist, also a sculptor, named Edoardo Palazzi. And again, you have in this one, the word pop prominent and giving it lay claim that this might be the first pop art, because Palazzi showed the collage in 1952 in London. So Hamilton might have seen it, who knows? Meanwhile, on our side of the pond, you have another progenitor of pop art in the 1950s, and that would be Jasper Johns, of course, with his flag, circa 1954-55. And according to Johns, he said it came to him in a dream. He said, painting a flag triggered many related ideas. Using the design of the American flag took care of a great deal for me because I didn't have to design it. So I went on to similar things like the targets, things the mind already knows. That gave me room to work on other levels. Now, though he will go on to produce many more early progenitors of pop art, the flags were his first that literally stamped him. Now, whether, we don't know for sure, but this is a window display. By day, Rauschenberg, like many artists, worked doing window displays, and Bonwit Teller in New York City was known for having very artistic, somewhat extravagant window displays. So, you know, this might have been how Johns might have used it in one of his window displays. There's Bonwit Teller from that era. And there's some of the, you know, very avant-garde for the time graphic design and use of the window display space. And then we move to the spring of 1961 at this point in our early pop art timeline. And we get this Bonwit Teller display of mannequins posed in front of a series of canvases. Some of them look like clippings from newspapers and big paintings of advertising art, like the big nose on the right. And that would be the work of another artist who was trying to get these paintings into art galleries, but couldn't. So he used them for Bonwit Teller. And yeah, that would be Andy Warhol. What had he been doing all through the 1950s? He conquered the world of commercial art illustration. He was at the top of the New York City game with art like this, which looks very modern, of course. He was especially known for his very filigreed shoes. There's the signature down below. Here's that Bonwit Teller display from the spring of '61 in some kind of Bonwit Teller catalog. So why are we most interested, of course, in the Superman at the center? Well, remember, he roomed with Philip Pearlstein. Maybe he had that in mind when he did this image. So where did Warhol base this image on, as he based all his imagery from his environment, from photographs, from clippings? Well, it comes from an issue of DC Comics Lois Lane, dated April of 1961. But that means in comic book terms, comics are always dated 3 to 4 months ahead to encourage retailers to keep them on the stands longer. So that means this issue actually came out probably in late January of 1961. Here's, of course, now the cover's by the artist Kurt Swan, but the interior of Lois Lane was by one of the great Silver Age comic artists, along with Kurt Swan, and that would be Kurt Schaffenberger. So in this story, as we turn the page, yep, there's the panel that Warhol would hone in on as being the one that he wanted to most emulate as a giant canvas. You can see in places where he decided to obscure the type, eliminate all those speed lines from the super breath that Schaffenberger so beautifully rendered in his panel. You can see that the clouds are pretty much the same billowed brushstrokes that Schaffenberger employed. Lack of detail on Superman, the trunks and the boots. But yeah, now Warhol, obviously was into comics, because this is the closest Batman title from 1958 that we can most compare to one of his next giant canvases. This is also dated 1960. And once again, we would call it distressed Batman logo. So Warhol at this time is trying to make the move from commercial art to fine art. And the paintings he's doing are all comic strip and comic book inspired. So now this Dick Tracy that he does in 1960 might have been aware of the San Francisco-based artist Jess. His last name was Collins. He did a series of giant painting / collages of Dick Tracy comics called Tricky Cad. Now, maybe even Jasper Johns saw it when he did his collage based on an alley-oop comic strip. Johns does this in 1958. So again, these are things that Warhol could have seen or been aware of what artists were doing with comics and comic strips. So that might be why Warhol took this clipping from, looks like, a daily newspaper that he read. And, Warhol said, I read the comic strips because they make me laugh, because they're such beautiful drawings. I like the colors and the balloons. I think people should always talk with balloons over their heads. So here's a stencil kind of painting that he makes of Popeye, also circa 1960. Well, the great American art dealer based in New York, Ivan Karp, knew about Warhol's work trying to do sort of comic inspired paintings. He said, hey, Andy, I want you to come see an artist that I'm representing who's also doing comic strip based stuff. So Ivan Karp takes Warhol over to this guy's studio, and Warhol sees a giant canvas of Popeye. By the way, this is now the fall of 1961. Keep that in mind. Warhol did his canvases in the spring in Bonwit Teller in New York City. Roy Lichtenstein, the name of this artist that Karp takes him over to see, was doing giant paintings like this. Now, of course, Roy Lichtenstein would go on to become equally associated, if not more so, with pop art itself, as Andy Warhol is. I mean, in 1966, Newsweek commissioned Lichtenstein to do its pop cover, It's What's Happening. Now, the third pop artist of the trinity of Warhol, Lichtenstein would be Mel Ramos, also San Francisco based. This is a later picture, of course, before he passed away a few years ago. But in those early years of 60, 61, 62, he's doing paintings of comic strip inspired heroes like Lee Falk's The Phantom. Here's a painting of Batman inspired by, looks like a Kurt Swan version. If you can see Ramos's kind of three-dimensional painting technique, the very thick strokes with the buildup of paint. Well, that's because his teacher and mentor was the great Wayne Thiebaud, who only recently passed away, I think this year, a couple months ago, maybe. Thiebaud was known for doing these beautiful paintings of very Americana objects, a lot of pastry and food, but beautifully done and with that very thick painting technique. So here's another Mel Ramos, dated 1962. And of course, that would make sense because the comic book that he took it from was dated August of 61, which means it was on sale in, let's say, May of 61. So who knows? Ramos might have seen Warhol's Superman when he went, but you know, he was on the other coast. But that's how he transformed Kurt Swan's drawing. And, you know, I'll take Swan. But, you know, Warhol might have been aware of all of this and was in a quandary in the sense of everybody was doing comics. Liechtenstein, once he did the Ben Day Dots, is doing it better. And that's what made Warhol make the shift to the classic silkscreen technique and the repetition of the American iconic objects from the commercial consumer environment, the soup cans, the Coke bottles. You know, according to, I think, I forget which book, I think Popism maybe, that Warhol wrote with Pat Hackett. I think there's a quote where he talks about showing the art critic Emile D'Antonio one version of the Coca-Cola painting that was more like an abstract expressionist version, and this other that was more like this classic silkscreen. And D'Antonio pointed to this one on the screen now and said, forget the abstract expressionist one. This is who we are. This is America. And that's what influenced Warhol to go in this direction. Then, of course, would come the Brillo boxes, followed by the Marilyns and all the great imagery. And by 1965, Warhol is a darling of the media, and with his first media-created superstar, Edie Sedgwick, who was the it girl of 1965. By 1966, okay, so maybe Newsweek gave their cover to Liechtenstein, but there's Warhol on the cover in March of the great Barbara Feldon from Get Smart. Later on in 66, Warhol is in August 66 Esquire, nothing to do with Cassius Clay, but in this article called Remember the 60s, authors David Newman and Robert Benton would go on to, I think, write the Superman screenplay or the first attempt at it, I think. But the caption underneath this photograph reads, yes, it's Batman and Robin. And yes, it's Andy Warhol and his latest girl person named Nico. And that, friends, is the 60s, whether you like it or not. But don't worry, the 60s are over. You know, this would be the kind of satirical thing that National Lampoon would later do. But this is Esquire in 1966 at the height of Batmania. Now, here's somebody's, I think, hand-tinted version of that black and white photograph, so you can get more of a sense of what it was really like. Now, who was Nico? Well, Nico was the German-born, actually her name was Christa Afgen. She was a singer, a songwriter, musician, a model, and an actress. She had roles in Fellini's Dolce Vita in 1960 and ended up in Warhol's own Chelsea Girls in 66. So the next year, Warhol would produce, yeah, that's Lou Reed, and would recommend Nico as his singer. And that's how Nico came to sing 4 songs on the Velvet Underground's debut album, titled The Velvet Underground and Nico. That's how they were first titled in that first great album that came out in '67. So here's a great picture of Warhol with Nico. And so this is '66 when, you know, she's on the rise. And I love the fact that Warhol chooses to be Robin. I mean, it's so modern that he would do that, that he would see himself as the sidekick, not as the star. Here's some outtakes from the photo shoot. But keep in mind, remember, Warhol was a big Batman fan. Remember, 1960, 6 years earlier, he had done this. You know, these early paintings are still being given very prominent respect in all of these posthumous Warhol retrospectives. So we flash, you know, from 1966, flash forward 15 years, it's 1981. And the next time you would see an exhibition poster of Warhol's work that would include a superhero would be this, what he called his Myth series of 10 silkscreen prints in 1981. And here's how they were first shown at the Ronald Feldman Gallery, the Fine Arts Gallery in New York City. And you can see all the icons, Howdy Doody, Uncle Sam, some of them mixed photographs of real people, some of them photographs of the actual things like the Howdy Doody. But yeah, out of the 10, Superman reappears in Warhol's oeuvre, as they say. And there were many different versions of this essential image that I was able to gather for this webinar. So the silkscreen technique and the multiple screens allows you to do these kind of images. And then this will give you a sense of how they were seen on exhibit. I would say this image of all of the Superman variations has become possibly the most prominent one. At least when you go to Google it, this is the one that comes up the most. And it's got the signature. You know, a lot of these others don't have the signature on them. So here's the first poster for the Ronald Feldman Fine Arts Incorporated. Now, when you flip it over, the copyright, there's Ronald Feldman Fine Arts, but there's another copyright for DC Comics. This interpretation created by Andy Warhol is derived from an original version of Superman. Notice they don't give that artist, they don't give that name away, copyrighted by DC Comics. So DC's artist is anonymous. So who was drawing DC Comics that influenced Warhol? I mentioned them before, the great Curt Swan, the baby boomer Superman artist, drew Superman full-time from like 1957 to 1986, 29 years straight, thousands of covers, literally, the entire Superman family. The flying positions he would codify as the classic Superman flying images. In the early 70s, he would have a different inker. For you non-comic book aficionados, Swan would just pencil the drawings and another artist would come in and ink them in black line. So look at the difference in style between the 1960s inker George Klein and his early 70s inker Murphy Anderson, much more heavily brushed, lots of blacks added. So in 1973, as you can see in the index information down below, we have this Curt Swan, Murphy Anderson Superman story. And as we flip over page 1, what do we see on page 2? But yes, that's the figure that Warhol chose. If we tilt it a little, you can see how this is the image that becomes his 1981 silkscreen Superman. So the 80s would be Warhol's last decade with us. In 1987, of course, the shocking, really premature death. And, you know, they settled the wrongful death suit with the hospital out of court. So I'm sure that that means that the hospital probably paid billions, who knows. But he never should have died. And if you've seen the recent documentary on Netflix, not only did he have a premonition of dying and going back to the hospital, but it's just, it's really sad that, and yet as a visionary, his work really predicted the future. So whatever happened with Warhol's Superman works and comics in general in post Warhol's death? Well, 2 years later, after Warhol passes in 1989, he finally gets the retrospective that that moment never gave him while he was alive. And in the spring of, right, I think the exhibition opened in March of '89. The big, thick, I mean, this is like an 11 by 14 inch hardcover catalog resine book, maybe like 3 inches thick, that I remember picking up on St. Mark's Place when I was living in the East Village at that time in the late 80s. And I'm flipping through the book. I've always loved Andy Warhol's work, especially because I knew he had done those Superman works. And then I come to a double page spread of these peculiar Superman collages. Now, I say peculiar because I'm looking at them and I see, according to the information down below, they're all dated 1960 to 61. Well, I knew those were his early pop art years and that he had done his first Superman in 61. But I'm looking at these now. These are not paintings, remember. These are actual collages using Superman comic book panels. They look like they're pasted on canvas. By the way, these works are done on canvases, again, about 11 by 14 inches. So I'm looking at those panels and I recognize where the art came from. I was a kid reading Superman comics in the 60s. Well, if this was dated 1960, and there's the page it's from, well, that page is from this story when Superman killed his friends. And that's the artist Pete Costanza. But the cover to the issue was by Kurt Swan and George Klein. And that's dated January 1968. Yes, folks, how could a collage dated 1960 use comic book art that was on sale in the fall of 1967? The second panel is from this page by the Superman ghost artist. They were never credited, Al Plastino. And that comes from this September 1967 issue of Action Comics. Okay, let's move on. These panels I recognize as Kurt Swan, inked by Jack Abel. And I was reading Superman then. Those are from like 1968 or 69. So the top panel, you can recognize there. The bottom panel comes from this page, same story. And there's the Kurt Swan. I don't know if Jack Abel inked that cover. That might be Mike Esposito for you aficionados. But again, this is November 1967. Or 60, that might be 69. Okay, top panel is from that same story from late 67. Bottom panel is from that other issue that I just showed you with Captain Incredible. Okay, next one. Okay, remember that panel I showed? Again, whoever put these together just clipped out panels, it seems. Now we'll talk about whether it was Warhol or who knows. If you know the factory scene, by the way, the bottom panel is again from that same story I've already shown you. If you know how Warhol worked, first of all, he didn't always sign his work. Sometimes he had his mother sign his work. Where does that top panel come from? Same story as before. Again, same story as before, the top left panel from that issue. The bottom panel from that same sequence that I've already shown you 3 times before. So, did Andy Warhol fraudulently make these? Did one of his factory people years later in the 60s put them together? Well, at the time, I wanted to publicize this. I felt that whoever put together these forgeries assumed that nobody would know the difference. By dating them 1960, he puts them in the value of his early seminal works. So this is the piece of art I illustrated and tried to get around the New York media world. Now, who is Shinehouse? Well, that was my friend that I knew, Richard Shinehouse, from my Rhode Island School Design days in the late 70s. And he was a fellow comic book fan. I remember calling him up and saying, Richard, have you seen this new Warhol catalog? And it was like we completed each other's sentences. And we both said those are forgeries. Those could not have been done in 1960. They were all from comics used years later. Well, Richard's wife, Gail Stavitsky, was able to get this story placed in the San Francisco Chronicle sometime soon after. Warhol works may be fakes, big fuss in art world. Now, this is the only remaining copy I have of her article, but I'll make it a little easier on the eyes by showing you yet another fraudulent collage dated 1960. You can see on the left, that's a 1963 Action Comics issue. Even those couple of years later, still makes a difference. The bottom left panel is the top panel in this collage. Now, later on that summer in July, I think because of this Chronicle story, the New York Times picked up the story. Tuesday, July 11th, 1989. Questions on authenticity of 19 Warhol collages. Now, let me make it a little sharper. So, the authenticity of 10 Superman collages attributed to Andy Warhol has been questioned by 2 comic book experts. They noticed that the collages are dated 60-61, several years before the cartoon panels that were used to make them appeared in print. Either they were misstated or somebody else has made work out that is not what it proposes to be. Robert Miller, a New York City art dealer, who owns 18 of the collages, told the San Francisco Chronicle, which reported the mismatch of dates today. Oh, so this is the same date as the Chronicle. The discrepancy was noticed by the comic book experts Arlen Schumer and Richard Shinehouse during separate visits to a Warhol retrospective that was on show at the Museum of Modern Art from February to May 2nd. The collages include cutouts from Superman comic books pasted on paper and splattered. So I remember, yeah, okay, I went a little too fast there, but the series of 19 collages has been estimated to be worth about $5 million. Each piece was signed twice and dated 60-61. 7 collages were on display during the retrospective of the modern. 6 were lent by Mr. Miller and 1 by an unidentified private collector. In a statement today, the museum said, in any retrospective of an artist, there may be questions regarding dating. However, we have no reason whatsoever to doubt the authenticity of any of the works included in the Andy Warhol retrospective. Edward Hayes, a lawyer for the Warhol estate, said today that the discrepancy in dating was being investigated, but that a preliminary examination indicated the collages were authentic. The estate checked signatures. At least one work that is owned by one estate and known to be authentic is similar to the 19 pieces in question, he said. The estate, he added, has checked some of the signatures on collages and verified that they are Warhols. However, Vincent Fremont, a director and secretary treasurer of the Warhol Foundation, told the Chronicle that he did not recall seeing the collages during the 60s and 70s. There's nothing I have seen, Fremont said. I've worked with Andy since I was 18, and you didn't see them being bought and sold. See what I'm saying? Gerard Malango, who became Warhol's first studio assistant in '63, said by telephone that he saw the collages for the first time at the exhibition. When I saw them at the museum, let's scroll past Sally of Harry Met Sally, I was truly surprised by them in a fascinated way, Malanga said. I was fascinated because I knew almost everything Andy was doing at the time, and I thought, why did I know about these things? He said that when he learned about the discrepancy in dates, he began to doubt that the works were Warhol's. Based on Andy's sensibility, there would have been no room for him to sit down and make these pieces. These pieces required someone to sit down at a kitchen table with scissors and glue. Andy would not have taken the time to do something like that. He also said that during '61, Warhol's comic book images were paintings, not collages. Folks, remember I showed you his actual paintings were really in '60 and '61. Mr. Malanga theorized that Warhol might have predated and signed the collages as a favor to a young artist. And he was known to be kind of cocky in that way, playful, a prankster, he said. Mr. Malanga also said that Warhol often had his assistants sign his works for him. Folks, you can actually find this article when I Googled the topic itself. So there you can see I'm actually credited. Now, Richard Scheinhaus's wife, Gail, would be able, in the September '89 issue of Contemporanea, the international art magazine, to expand on her Chronicle article with a 5-page piece that shows some of the same collages and source material. And she really goes in depth in this article, and you can find it just like I did. I mean, this issue arrived today, the day I'm putting this webinar together. So I was able to get these in at the last minute, thanks to Richard turning me on to it. But she really comes up with some interesting theories that Warhol might have been doing these collages that all deal with Superman losing his powers, making blunders, killing his friends after he got shot, and was recuperating and maybe reading these comic books, that are from, some of them from 1968. As we turn the page in Gail's article, there were more of these collages that weren't in the MoMA catalog. I wasn't able to find the source of the top panel, but that bottom panel comes from that same Al Placino story with Captain Incredible. So that is all that ever happened with the story. Neither I nor Richard were able to get this anywhere past the idea that how can fraudulent works wind up in the catalog of record of the second greatest artist, the greatest artist of the second half of the 20th century. Now, the Museum of Modern Art would go on years later. They've never done a show on comics. They did a show in 2007 called Comic Abstraction, subtitled Image Breaking, Image Making. And it was all about fine artists appropriating the visual and verbal language of comics in their two-dimensional, even sculptural works. Yes, this is a room filled with balloons, word balloons. Get it? The little curly cues, yes. And you can see them here in MoMA's exhibit. A lot of the two-dimensional works are artists like Keith Haring that appropriated simple black outline, bright color comic book style art in his work. You know, there's work by artists in the decades since that you can, you know, they're abstract, but you can see the Superman images in them. This is a piece I think I found on the internet, done about a decade ago by a photorealist painter. That's what that is. So, you know, is that really making a comment on the art? Is it really actually a better work of art than the great Neil Adams original from 1971? There are some fine artists today, like William Ray, that are doing legitimate paintings with, in a sense, realistic, almost cosplay looking superheroes. So it's interesting that Warhol, once again, from the beginning, was the visionary of putting comics first and foremost into the fine art world, obviously being influenced by those who came before, like all great artists are. Again, these key Superman images would be given the respect of representing Warhol's entire body of work, as you can see in this. You know, this is the retrospective, same year, 89, 2 years after he died, but using that Superman painting and giving it that significance. How about his silkscreen from 1981? Is that being remembered as one of his great works? Well, when you go on the internet and you Google Andy Warhol Superman, you get this website and the artist Umberto Elvises doing his take on Warhol's Superman. It's like doing a Warhol of a Warhol. And how about this tribute?
This Warhol from the Myth series is also another one where it would appeal to children because they could recognize exactly who that is, and yet it's so changed because we have how many Supermen here impose on each other, and we have a huge amount of action actually happening, and you could begin to let them, encourage them to see what was happening here with the lines. And by encourage them, I would never say what's happening down here, but their eye will roam around that and they'll begin to see that there are these lines. Well, what do those lines represent? Why are they there? Why does this piece seem to be jumping off the wall? Those are all questions that children would sort of answer themselves.
Enough said, folks. Well, then what about then the fact that you could still get a copy of the 1989 catalog like I just did? I went on eBay and you can still get this, whether, I don't know whether if they've had future editions that have excised them. But, you know, when you go to Google, like I did, you know, Andy Warhol Superman collages, this is the page that comes up. Yeah, Warhol Superman collages. What's interesting is that the only ones that come up, if you notice, they're all the same. And what's interesting is that the one that you can Google, they all go to the same site, this site called ArtNet. And what's interesting about this collage, dated 1960, well, it's only 1 year off, because if you remember, yes, this might be the only legitimate collage, but remember, it comes from that comic illustrated by Kurt Schaffenberger. The bottom panel comes from the same story, the final page, from an issue on sale in early '61. So even this possibly legitimate collage was still not done in 1960. So, you know, the mystery of, you know, these Warhol collages that you can still find in the catalog of record of his work still shows that those works are fraudulent works. Fraudulent works in the oeuvre of the greatest artist of the second half of the 20th century. And yet, because it's comics that still don't get the respect they deserve by the mainstream fine art world, there will always be this flaw in the diamond, Superman logo shaped like a diamond, of a career that is Andy Warhol's. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you. That's been Warhol Superman. My name is Arlen Schumer. I designed this logo. I mean, I've been entwined with Superman as much as Andy Warhol was in my own way. There's the great DC logo created by the great DC letterer Irish Snap. And I just did my take on it. If you go to my website, arlenschumer.com, you'll see my works of comic style illustration and history. And by history, I mean primarily the book that I did, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. When you go to my website, you can see that it's really about the art of that era. And I even take out the original word balloons and put the artist talking about the art. So that's Steve Ditko's Spider-Man on top, Carmen Infantino's Flash at the bottom. Can't do a book about the Silver Age of Comics without the baby boomer Superman, Kurt Swan. You can see there are equal amounts of George Klein ink Swan icons and Murphy Anderson, primarily on the left side. A third page devoted to Swan is all about his many statues and solemn works of that era that really are revealing of the stature that he gave Superman. And that silver Superman image is one of the greatest. The last page of my book is called Man and Superman, that details my background with Superman in summer camp. The first comic book I encountered was that silver statue annual cover in the summer of '63. A postcard I sent back to my mother from summer camp has Superman. In the lower left, that's me in 8th grade doing an oral report on a lawsuit between DC Comics suing Captain Marvel for infringement in 1953, Fawcett Publications. And then I closed back when I had a goatee. Comic book art inspired my life and career, though it's still often treated like a stepchild by mainstream culture. Hence the nobody cares about the Warhol forgeries. The debt I owe one of the greatest American art forms of the 20th century can never fully be repaid. And there's a quote at the end. Somebody, a friend of mine gave me, said, Arlen, this quote is you. A man's work is nothing but the slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened. Yes, that's by Albert Camus, the great existentialist writer. Come on Facebook. I run 3 comics history groups, one on the Silver Age itself, one on the great Jack Kirby, and the artist who influenced me the most, Neil Adams, and like a whole generation. I do comic book art, but for advertising and editorial usage. And one of my specialties is turning people into superheroes, but keeping the photographic look at the same time. So I've often turned people into Superman, like David Geffen. I've used the chest opening image, subverting the S into a $sign for my first one-man show in New York City a couple of years ago. How about Superman for Super Peace? I use this image, conflating Jasper John's flag with the 60s peace symbol and the Clark Kent image. That was for a series of lectures I did at the CUNY Grad Center in 2001 which later would become my book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. I love doing takeoffs of the Clark Kent Superman thing. Publishers Weekly. I think we got a cease and desist from DC Comics saying your artist has cleverly turned the man's towel into turned his cape into a towel. I'm like, yeah. How about this cover for the Trade Magazine art direction, where I took the Superman creed and just illustrated it literally, faster than a speedy bulletin, more powerful than a locomotive, liable to increase small billings, it's been found. Look, it's a goodbye. It's a word, it's a plan, it's super creative, man. I've actually done magazine covers like this one for Cleveland, the home of Siegel and Schuster, the creators of Superman. So tying in Superman with Cleveland was a natural. There's a double page spread, utilizing the dots and the balloons like clouds to hold the type. I think this one was for Newsweek. No, Time Magazine. Yeah, must be less perfect. I did this cover for the mainstream book by Larry Ty. This art, I got to mesh kind of a early Joe Shuster Superman face with a little bit of Kurt Swan. This was art for a 3D pop-up card done by the company Pop Shots. And I did another Superman themed one, Let's Fly Away, with Superman and Lois above New York City. How about this card? You better watch out because Santa's been working out, kicking ass and taking names. For print magazine, the trade magazine, the graphic design field, every month they would give their back page to a different artist or graphic designer. So called a design scene, and you had to make a visual commentary. So there's Superman as a kind of a bagman in Times Square on a Brillo boxes in a crucifix position with Coca-Cola above his head, with comic books raining down. And comic books are books, comic books are art, comic books are graphic design. Why won't you listen to me? I got my MFA recently, and one of the assignments was take a classic and reinterpret it. So I did my Super Vitruvian Man, and it's approved by the Roman Catholic Church, ? Leonardo da Vinci Comics, that kind of worked out. Instead of DC, DV. And then I just took the Superman legend and put it, if you know Da Vinci's original, there's text below the famous image. Anyway, my illustration site's linked to my TeePublic site, which is a place where you can get knockoffs of over 125 of my illustrations and t-shirts, posters, decals, every application you could think of. There's my lectures and webinars site where you can click on links to both my YouTube channel that has videos of my works and my Vimeo channel as well of past webinars and live lectures. So this has been a free Zoom lecture, but next week I'll be doing another webinar with New York Adventure Club that I've been doing webinars with. Actually, April 1st will mark 2 years since the pandemic shutdown. And I've done this one before, but every time I do it again, I re-edit it and make it a little bit better. But coming on Monday, 21st at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And yeah, if you buy a $10 ticket, it gives you access to a recording of the webinar for a week if you can't make it live. And if you don't know who Vivian Maier is, maybe you'll agree with me that she is the greatest photographer of the 20th century. And then I resume my free Zoom webinars on the 23rd, Wednesday, all at 6 p.m. It's the 40th anniversary of Letterman's Late Night debuting. And Mark Carson, the photographer of all the bumper images, when the show went to commercial, and would come back, they would show these images of New York City locations, interiors, exteriors. And then the Late Night with David Letterman logo would be applied to make it look like it actually was there in the original photograph. But no, I was a recent graduate from Rhode Island School of Design. I ended up working in the NBC art department, and I did a lot of the lettering for the bumper photographs photographed by Mark Harzen. And this might be one of my favorites from Coney Island. I also did other graphics for the Letterman show, like Frank and Fred, their knockoff of Goofus and Gallant. Anyway, a week after that, I'll be doing a webinar. I believe this is the 30th now, on the great Fleischer Studios Superman cartoons. I'll be giving you the greatest hits of 17 cartoons. So get the popcorn, strap yourself in. And if you've never seen these cartoons, I'm going to blow your mind. Keeping with heroes of the 30s, how about Doc Savage by James Bama? The great paperback paintings of the 1960s. And the model, Steve Holland, on the left, who posed for Bama on 62 covers that I think are the greatest heroic paintings, heroic male figure paintings ever. And keeping with the pulp theme, a week later, now we're into April, The Shadow of Mike Kaluta. You know, 2023 will be a 50-year anniversary that he debuted in DC Comics version, The Shadow, which is really the definitive version. But I couldn't wait till 2023 to do this webinar. And then another one I've wanted to do for a long time. Yes, a webinar on the Great Green Hornet TV series with Bruce Lee as Kato. So folks, if you go to the events blog on my website, I always post my comings and goings with URL links, whether you need to just link or purchase a ticket. So thanks again, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to Warhol Superman, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.